breathe here. The results for ABCDE's first year are in. And yeah, there is no the before the name. The A already stands for an indefinite article. Meh. Anyway, we had 5 wonderful contestants this year, and I can do none of it proper justice. As you can see, the video quality here is significantly degraded. Sorry about that. I am working on a very limited computer and can barely get this free online video editing software to work. So here's a stock photo of some apple pie, since I can't video edit or animate too easily. So I will have to make this video rather short. In a word, I loved all of your submissions. Every single one of them made me smile. In fact, I was gonna go about judging by going merely in submission order, but I figured I was gonna scrap that actually. I wanted to take time to open the discussion and drive home how happy I was with all of these by first talking about I thought this submission was fantastic. And I mean that. Was it a joke entry? Sure, and I could appreciate that. But to begin the actual judging, let's take a look at why. We'll start with the first criterion, which was adherence to a unified synesthetic experience. For this, F received 85 out of 100. I mean that, genuinely. This language took a trivial concept, relexing the English language in such a way that everything feels like F, and ran with it. And that counts and is entirely valid. In this criterion, it only loses points for relating letters to letters, and as such loses a bit of like conceptual meaning. But it works, right? So then next is the aesthetic coherence. Solid 100 out of 100. I mean, the language is, by being so trivial, entirely coherent. There isn't much to say here. I mean, you found a loophole and exploited it masterfully. The conceptual idea was presented entirely efficiently. Excellent job, right? And next is the emotionally evocative nature of the art, which is also a solid 100 out of 100. And this is where the language shines, and it's sort of why I wanted to start with it. This submission was the only one, I think, to fully understand the assignment when it came to emotional evocation. It's funny. It is, right? Speaking it, one cannot help but laugh. The emotion exudes from the synesthetic relationship ceaselessly, right? If I were to speak this continually for a long passage, I would laugh and laugh, then get annoyed as the sound became bothersome, and then be reduced again to laughter. Why? Well, because so I guess moving on to the last category is versatility, which was 5 out of 100, right? Obviously, this language is essentially unusable for all practical purposes. Word length being the only marker of word meaning renders the language, shall we charitably say, such as to not entirely disqualify it, plagued by homophones. That, we can phrase it this way, is how I justify this as a 5 out of 100 as opposed to a 0 out of 100. But, and this is important. One or just a few minor tweaks would have rendered this language completely usable. Say, for example, that word length is now the rank of the word in the dictionary, such that every word has a unique length of Fs in it. maybe tweak it so that instead of being a relex of English, it were a modified version of, Tokipona, and had fewer basic words in the lexicon to keep it, usable on human timescale, so you don't have like 100,000 Fs, right? But, maybe vary the grammar a little bit so it isn't purely a relex, right? But had you done those, then your versatility would be very high. And looking at the math, you would have actually won the competition outright. And I wanted to emphasize that. I thought, joke entries. I want to emphasize during the competition that joke entries were very welcome, and I'm so glad that I did that because. We had a gem like this, So F receives a total score of 290. Excellent show. So next, let's look at the next entry, which was MVCC, beginning with the criterion of a unified synesthetic experience. The entry gets a very solid 95 out of 100. The phonology is colors and shapes, or sound articulation and chords, all related to texture. This idea was cleanly articulated and implemented. It was a simple concept that transferred nicely onto the idea of phonotactics and grammar. Um, I'd say the writing system, I'm not going to count that one too much for this criterion, as the main focus of the language is on the sounds and the articulation of those sounds and how those relate to colors and texture. So, like, the writing system can sort of be whatever, right? And you did it. You had the romanization, the scribble type uh, orthography, But as regards MVCC's use of national anthems for nations, I think that it was fun. It was fun. But while fun, I think it minorly detracted from the synesthetic aspect, as it sort of broke slightly from the remainder of the sensory framework. So I don't think this gets 100 out of 100, but I think that it was still a cool little play on the project as a music lang, right? Um, so very very strong in this category. Um, Next is aesthetic coherence, which is 87 out of 100. The language being produced via an ensemble production is highly coherent and unites the language as a means of enacting the sensory relational framework. Right? The use of instrumentation for voicing was, I think, the most unifying feature, as it actually used the ensemble nature of the language in the grammar itself, allowing the synesthetic feeliness to be embedded in the relationship between words as opposed to, just the words themselves. So that is to say, the textures and colors elevate one another and move beyond merely being sort of X feels like Y. The phonotactics, being the rules of chord composition and sequencing, also achieve this, right? A sort of coherence. They helped the textures of each morpheme integrate cleanly with one another. And the associations of instruments with colors and textures are the actual medium of conveyance of the synesthetic relationships, right? Um, as for hindrances, I'd say that having mainly storytelling as the use case for the language would otherwise benefit aesthetic coherence, especially as this is played by an ensemble. But I think there's just a very minor hindrance caused by this, which is that the storytelling use of the language wasn't cleanly established as being purposefully integrated with the synesthetic relationships. You see? So that's to say that the synesthetic relationships don't elevate the storytelling goal or vice versa, in the language's use. But still, solid 87 out of 100 for aesthetic coherence. So next is the versatility of the language. 80 out of 100. The language was built with a coherent morphosyntactic alignment, word order, and so on. I appreciate the verb subject word order with only intransitive verbs, it was a risky choice. Nevertheless, I am not entirely convinced that on a technical basis there are actually no intransitive verbs. Not to be Agmashwa, your language must have verbs, and but I don't know that I'm convinced that there are no intransitive verbs. I think I'm only convinced that there may be constructions with multiple sentences that enable transitivity by the main verb. But again, it's almost a side point. The language is usable in terms of its word order. Um, the limitation of being primarily used for storytelling purposes does show in the lack of tam markers and the use of indicative tone, which affects versatility, but not to the point that it damages overall usability. It works for the intended purpose, right? Um, so the language can't score too low on versatility, as it has much resemblance, in fact, I think, to Tokipona, and thus can in fact be used generally, right? Even though outside of its intended you know main purpose. Um, so the accommodation for proper nouns also solidifies language's usability in general. So yeah, very very usable. If you happen to have an entire ensemble. But yeah, as we saw, humans playing the ensemble. So, um, and then next is the emotionally evocative criterion, and MVCC scores 70 out of 100. And this is where I kind of struggled most with MVCC. The instrumentation and composition of the pieces in the language are beautiful. I know you were kind of going for like a Xenakis kind of thing, and that really shone through. But what emotions exude from the synesthetic experience here within? I'm not sure. Beauty is not intrinsically an emotion, right? So, although the joy arising from it is. So, if I had to say what primary emotion I can read from the language, having listened to the sample text, is that of fulfillment while actually perceiving the textural and color relationships, right? In that sort of conceptual art, Xenakis kind of way. Um, and so as I mentioned earlier, the relationship of the synesthetic relationships to the use of the language as storytelling as a vehicle could have been more cleanly used to evince emotion and demonstrate how the feelings of the sensory relationships are intended to bring those emotions about. Right? You could have done that. So as I said, the language does produce emotion insofar as it is inherently beautiful in articulation, and as such, can't fare too poorly. It was a pleasure and honor to hear an ensemble play for our humble little competition here, and they did so very pleasantly, I must add. Thus, MVCC lands with a total score of 332, all said and done. Next, let's look at Haspyid. I think I am pronouncing that one correctly. And I quite enjoyed this one as it just sounded quite nice, to the ear. And also the presentation, as with all of these, just, it made me chuckle. Now, this language, starting in the Unified Synesthetic Experience category, scored 60 out of 100. Each consonant is mapped to a conceptual quality which functions as a root. I am not sure, however, what the unifying idea is for these qualities as a whole. That is to say, qualities like largeness, newness, and so on are symbolically tied to the qualities of the sounds, but the qualities themselves are not within some sort of larger coherent category to which the sounds map. So we can say firmly that there is a mapping, although it is not what I would necessarily say is unified. And it does have some sense of intent for assignment. So I'm comfortable with a rating of 60 here. Next is the aesthetic coherence, which is a 50 out of 100. I'll go back to the wording of the original scoring criterion, which was within the cross conceptual mode, how successfully was the aesthetic or conceptual idea presented? Well, this language was designed to feel good, as it, that's the name. And I am not entirely sure how the conceptual mapping achieves that, right? The concepts of largeness and newness don't intrinsically feel good per se. Although perhaps maybe with MVCC, I would say I can uh, perceive the sense of fulfillment in that sort of conceptual art way of perceiving the mappings continually through while speaking. But I will reiterate that I did think that the language does in fact feel quite nice to the ear. And that may not be synesthetic in nature, but it's still an aesthetic choice. And I think it at least succeeds in the practical aspect of the intended result, which is feeling good, and it does so in a comprehensive way. So 50 out of 100, I think, is justified. On to versatility, this entry scores a 60 out of 100. Vowels determine the part of speech, so we definitely have the capacity to form sentences, right? Although to the exclusion of adverbs, articles, and most other parts of speech. But the stacking of final consonants to build words is a bit unclear as to how one would specifically specify meaning, by the combination of those consonant morphemes. And so, in fact, I'm not entirely sure how the translation text works, but nevertheless, the pieces of the language that do work, right, do so well enough that I can see the basic structure of the language functioning, and I think there is enough area for play that, like Tokipona, which I know I keep mentioning, speakers could work it out into something functional as a baseline, right? Establish some sort of like way of stacking those final morphemes in a way that we can sort of agree on how those generate words, right? Compound words. So it's versatile, in principle, right? And so finally, for this language, we have the emotional evocation, which is a 50 out of 100. So I've already sort of touched on the fact that the synesthetic coherence of the language is a bit unwound, and as such, emotional evocation is a bit hard to see directly, but the language, as I've said, is intended to feel good and does at least achieve that pleasantness. So, hasp yid comes away with a total score of 220. Now we look at Oh Crap, I'm Late. And I very much appreciated the entire vibe of this thing. The presentation alone was a sight to behold. So, starting with the unified synesthetic experience, it scores a 45 out of 100. This was the main weakness of the language, not because feeliness was not evoked, but because it wasn't quite clear what the conceptual or sensory modes being related were. So, my understanding is that the grammatical features were intended to feel like emotional qualities related to being late. So, frustration in swearing being related to adpositions, confusion and stuttering feeling like noun cases, and so on. However, this is only my assessment, right? So, I cannot clearly tell with certainty that that is what the intended synesthetic relationships were. And I think had it been just a little bit more uh, directly stated that that is the was the target, I would have been felt more confident rating it higher in this category. But without that, while I can think of ways in which this language is synesthetic, I can't rate it higher than a 50 in this category because um, I don't feel 100% confident that I know what the actual mapping is. But because the ways in which I can conceive of the relationships being present are not too hard to assess, I won't rate it much lower than that either, right? Um, and then this sort of moves into the aesthetic coherence, which this language did much, much higher, 82 out of 100. So the sensation of being 20 minutes late just drips from this entry, and every single feature of the language continually reinforces that, right? Stuttering, umming, half swearing, all grammaticalized, all providing actual meaning. That is very coherent as an aesthetic, synesthetic or otherwise, and pulls it off very well. The writing system actually adds to this, right? So I know with MBCC I hadn't considered the writing system too much. With this one, I think the writing actually does add to it. So even though it's only just a font choice of being scribbled quickly, I think it works well, right? Just even for the aesthetics of the language, in terms of coherence. So, for what synesthetic associations we can draw from the language, they do appear to act as the basis for the aesthetic, and as such, we can say that we have transcended merely X feels like Y. But because we don't have a clear delineation of what the synesthetic relationships actually are, this category is inherently hindered just a bit. On to versatility. This scores a solid 100. I mean, the language is related to English and Spanish as primary influences with some German sprinkles, and this gives the language a major leg up in its versatility, right? There is little standing in its way, and even its minor verbosity of ums and uhs does not actually hinder it from being useful, right? There isn't much else to say here, in fact. It just works well functionally, right? I look at the translation text. I'm like, oh, yeah, I can clearly see how this works. And I don't have to think too hard about, what if I was saying something else? It just, I can clearly see how it works. And then finally, with emotional evocation, it scored a 75 out of 100. This language is rooted in the feelings of anxiety and stress, and it comes through. The language is punchy, rapid, and as you put it, head on as possible via its very simple grammar and conditional pro drop feature. The swearing and stumbling over words absolutely evoke the emotional track of rushing, and in fact, the fact that there is some verbosity in word repetitions is precisely the natural inefficiencies we would expect from somebody rushing. However, the, is the synesthetic relationship, set themselves what yield the emotional sensation? It's hard to tell. I want to rate this higher, but I just can't justify it without knowing what the feeling mapping is really intended to be, right? So again, had it just been a little clearer, would have scored higher in this category. So lateness slang lands with a very healthy total score of 302. And last, at least according to you linear time beings, but most certainly not least, is Azon Lang. This entire entry was very cute, and I loved the OCs that were described in it. Now, insofar as it had a unified synesthetic experience, it scores a 65 out of 100. It relied on the use of fire as its main synesthetic proxy. Its sound system had only voiceless fricatives and stops for consonants, whereas vowels can be plain, voiceless, fire, or voiceless and fire, with phonotactings dictating how these can be placed with respect to the voiceless and fire R and Q phonemes, respectively. There are noun cases of fire, animate, inanimate, empty, and ice. I see that fire appears to be the unifying synesthetic idea here, which plays into the idea of the language being related to toxicity as contrasted to ice. Um, for the other categories like animacy and emptiness, I'm not sure exactly how they fit within this synesthetic, framework. Um, so how these sort of unify together into a clear conceptual mapping is not entirely clear, but I can nevertheless assess that there is in fact a connection there, and it has a general theme, and so yeah, it scores decently in this category. Next, aesthetic coherence. 60 out of 100. The unifying aesthetic conceptual choice appears to be that Azon hates Kai as a sibling esque rivalry. And this is amplified by inserting one's own opinions into things, which was very funny to listen to. But these are not directly tied to the synesthetic relationship, I think, in an immediate way. There's an indirect link, bridge to them. But, nevertheless, the limited phonology does really help here because the high repetition of similar phonemes in very long words, in very long sentences, keeps the synesthetic relationships that we do have clearly established to fire and ice fresh in the mind, right? So that sort of does give us some basis of coherence in an aesthetic. Next is versatility, a clean 100. The language has the confusative morphosyntactic alignment system, which is one of those meme systems that I love. I know Flay Big Fish also loves them. And it has a generally usable word order. Right. It also has cases for verbs which have implicit noun classes in the event of nominalization, which seems fair to me, and I thought was actually kind of creative. So there's not much to say here. It doesn't take risks with the grammar which would threaten usability, so it retains a solid versatility, right? And lastly, in the emotionally evocative criterion, it scores a 70 out of 100. This is where the language had its feeliness most palpable. Even while scoring better in the versatility department, the emotions of this language shone through, I think, more clearly than other qualities of the language. In fact, I think what was supposed to be the synesthetic relationship, the feeling of toxicity in high school culture, wound up being the emotionally evocative piece in this language. The aesthetic experience carries through to an emotional result, which is toxicity, amplified by the enforced opinion telling. So the feeling of being silly and unserious, I think, was undersold in the presentation of the language. I felt it was quite clear here, right? I can continue speaking the language, and these feelings of silliness and unseriousness will be present and palpable, right? Azon hates Kai, and I can feel that. So even without a fully developed synesthetic framework guiding the language, it does serve as emotionally evocative art. There is a connection, however brief, between these emotions and the synesthetic traits of fire and ice and emptiness and so on. So, Azon Lang arrives with a total score of 295. Way to go. And thus concludes our first year of ABCDE. Thank you all so much for participating. As I said in the beginning, every single one of these submissions put a smile on my face. It was so fun seeing all the wonderful art that came out of this. We congratulate our winner, Circuits Board, for their excellent entry. Now, you linear time beings are welcome to reconvene next year for our next iteration of our contest. I will say, spoiler alert, that next year's contest was also fantastic. I can't wait to see you all there again. 柴你们头的